Welcome to This Way Up, the podcast dedicated to supporting parents and caregivers navigating the complex world of mental health. I'm Andrea, and each episode we dive deep into the conversations that matter, exploring the challenges, triumphs, and transformative journeys of those facing mental health struggles within their families. Whether you're here for expert advice, inspiring stories, or just a little boost to get you through the day, we've got you covered. So grab a cup of coffee, kick back, and join us as we find the bright spots in the mental health journey, because we're all climbing our way up together. Natasha, welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I am very excited to talk about anxiety and OCD, and only somebody who is in this space would get this excited to talk about it. But I think there is so much misconception and misunderstanding around those two that I am just really excited to get somebody who understands it and can talk deep into the details of what it's all about.
Oh, yeah. I can talk forever on those topics.
Yes,
sure.
I know. I have been a fan of yours for many years. Natasha Daniels is with us today, and she is an anxiety and OCD therapist and has over 2 decades of experience. She combines both her clinical experience with her lived experience, raising her own 3 kids that have anxiety and OCD. She is the creator of the website Parenting Survival, as well as the host to the show AT Parenting Survival podcast and the YouTube channel Ask the Child Therapist. She also gives in-depth support to thousands of parents raising kids with anxiety or OCD through her books, courses in the AT Parenting Survival online school, and in her online membership AT Parenting community. Her latest books includes Crushing OCD Workbook for Kids and her own memoir, Out of My Shell, Overcoming Social Anxiety from Childhood to Adulthood. Thank you again. Like I said, I think that you are going to shed a light on a topic that I think has gotten diluted over the years, quite frankly.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I would like to start with is, what is anxiety and what is an anxiety disorder?
Well, we all have anxiety. That's a healthy component of our brain, to keep us safe, to alert us to danger so that we can feel anxious, so that we can take some action. Our amygdala kind of protects us that way. But when we have an anxiety disorder, our amygdala is not working as that protector should. And so it is like the volume's turned up. There's all these false alarms. And so when someone has an anxiety disorder, they're immobilized by their anxiety. They feel that panic on a daily basis where it impedes their ability to function, whether socially, emotionally, or both.
So when kids these days are saying they're anxious, it's okay to be anxious.
Yes.
It actually becomes a disorder when it affects your life negatively.
Yes.
Now, what are some anxiety disorders that would be common for people to understand?
We have different labels for different things. The general reaction is the same, but you can have generalized anxiety disorder, where you have a full range of things that make you anxious, different themes. Some people can have health anxiety, where it's fixated around your health and well-being. You can have social anxiety, like I do, where it's predominantly, although I have generalized anxiety disorder too, full disclosure, but, where your main anxiety issue is around the fear of rejection or criticism. There's separation anxiety. There's lots of different flavors. I kind of call them flavors, but the feeling underneath and how you approach it is the same regardless.
Okay. So it's basically what is triggering the anxiety is kind of how they categorize it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I feel like, or like how it's showing up, where it's difficult. Because I think sometimes people think, well, my child doesn't have anxiety because they'll jump off a cliff, but put them in a dark room and they can't function, or put them in a lab where they have to get blood and they're hyperventilating and in a full-blown panic, and so anxiety isn't just about this temperament of inability to function in all areas, in all situations and environments. It's very specific depending on your anxiety themes.
Okay. So I guess one of the things that I've always got, why does it matter? Why does it matter if your child has anxiety when they're giving blood versus anxiety when they're with a group of their peers? Is the treatment different, or why is it important?
It does matter because, I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist, so it's going to matter for me because I take the approach of what is the core fear? And so if I understand the core fear, then I'm going to be reframing those cognitive distortions, setting up exposures or doing things for that situation. And that will look really different if I'm afraid of criticism and judgment versus I'm afraid of the dark and bad guys. And so I'm going to be tackling different core fears. So understanding those themes will help me develop where we're going to go with treatment, or even if I was a parent, where I'm going to go with that as a mom.
Got it. Now, OCD is tied to anxiety, but it's vastly different. Can you explain the difference between those two? Because I think sometimes those also get mumbled and jumbled all together.
Oh, all the time. Yeah. One of my, pet peeves. But I think that's just partly because OCD used to be in the DSM as an anxiety disorder. And so now it has its own category. And so I think a lot of times people think that OCD is a manifestation of anxiety, like a need for control. And so if the anxiety is really bad, then I'm going to develop OCD to try to control it. These are all things that I've heard from parents in my community. And actually, OCD is its own unique disorder. It has more to do physiologically. I like neuroscience. I'm definitely not a neuroscientist, but I think it's helpful to see that it's different parts of the brain. And so it is really physiologically different that OCD has to do with the circuitry in the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia. The amygdala doesn't like that and does freak out, but amygdala is like the primary show in anxiety. Like if you think about like a concert, it's like the amygdala is like the main event. And then with OCD, it's the circuitry in the basal ganglia and the prefrontal cortex. What also is different, for me to start speaking more English, is that OCD is bossy. And so OCD will have an intrusive thought. More often than not, OCD is more irrational, but it doesn't have to be. But more often it's nonsensical and irrational. So there's a flavor to it that's different than anxiety. And it's bossy. It needs you to do something or avoid something to get brief relief. Now with anxiety, there is avoidance. So if I am anxious around people or social situations, I might want to avoid the party, or I might want to avoid that conference. I want to avoid things that are going to trigger my anxiety. But when we talk about avoidance with OCD, it's very specific. It might be like, I'm going to avoid doorknobs, or I'm going to avoid sitting on the left side because if I sit on the left side, my mom's going to die. So I need to sit on the right. OCD shows up in bossy ways that we call compulsions, the need to do something or avoid something. And that could be mental. That can involve a parent or another person, or it can be independently like physical, if that makes sense.
It may involve a parent or it may be something physical. I didn't follow that.
So I'll give you an example. I might hand wash, right? I'll just use the stereotypes.
Yeah, that's okay.
So I might hand wash. I might mentally review how I hand washed, right? So I may not have to ever physically do something. I might have to mentally review something. What did I touch today? Let me go through my whole day. Or I might have to ask my mom, do my hands look clean? Those are 3 different examples of compulsions. So one is physical, me washing my hand. One is mentally reviewing, because I think we missed that one, the mental. One would be to avoid the doorknob, right? So I might just open it with my elbows, or I might avoid all doorknobs, or I might have to ask for reassurance from my parent. Those are all different examples of compulsions.
So when you're a parent and kids do quirky things all day long, I mean, part of it's just developmental, part of them is just that they're quirky. When do you as a parent have the red flag that goes up that says, or should go up that says, maybe I should get this checked out?
There's no definitive answer for that. It's hard.
Yeah.
I know with my own kids who have anxiety and OCD, I missed a lot of stuff because I did think they were just being quirky. Or sometimes there were things that I thought were OCD that were actually just quirkiness or actually ADHD. That I was like, oh my gosh, that's actually an ADHD issue. I didn't realize. But I think when you're seeing something that your child is doing that is repetitive, that's one red flag, or is rigid, or is nonsensical, right? I'm walking in a door, I have to walk out of the door. Then I'm walking in the door and I'm walking out of the door, and so I'm like these nonsensical repetitive behaviors, or I'm walking in a weird pattern. And I'm giving you random examples because honestly, there are so many different themes and so many different types of compulsions. And so it could really be anything. But when I'm seeing distress with that, so I interrupt that, right? You could do a little hypothesis or a little test. You can interrupt it naturally. And how distressed does your child get? Do they have to redo it? Do they get really upset with you? Because it's that distress component as well that is a red flag. Because even if you have an autistic child, they might have some rigidity and repetitive behaviors and certainly quirky things, or, they're stimming, and it can look similar to maybe an OCD compulsion, but there's not that distress component. If you interrupt it, maybe, they have to redo it, or they, move around you. But with OCD, you're going to get that distress.
And distress could be anger, typically anger,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Yes. It could be anger. It could be a meltdown. It could be a panic. It could be, just an extreme reaction.
If I remember correctly too, is that it sometimes morphs. It goes from one behavior or compulsion to another behavior or compulsion to another behavior or compulsion. Like you said, I think that when you said the word bossy, that was a great word for it. It kind of seizes your head, I think, for a little while to get things done. Very frightening, I think.
Yeah. And it does wear a lot of disguises. And so it does hop around. And so sometimes parents will be like, oh, my child has moral OCD, which is the intrusive thought that I'm a bad person, or I might turn into a bad person. And then all of a sudden they're dealing with contamination OCD, and they can't touch anything. And when parents focus on just the one theme or one issue, then they get overwhelmed, or they miss when it shifts, because OCD does like to jump around and pick a new theme. The foundation of how you approach it is always the same, but I think it can give you whiplash more so than anxiety, with how drastically different each theme is.
Now, so a child that has OCD could have a anxiety disorder on top of that as well. Is that right?
Yeah. And they are co-occurring conditions. So it's more likely that you would have anxiety if you have OCD, or vice versa, but not always.
Okay. So when a child is, so you've kind of got an idea that maybe something's not quite right. What's a parent to do at that point? You said test them and then bring them in for evaluation, or how do they evaluate to determine whether or not a child has OCD?
There are different assessment tools. SciBox is normally the go-to, which is the child version of the YBox. And you do, and some psychologists and psychiatrists and therapists just use like the DSM and talking to the child and seeing the criteria. OCD, really, for someone who's an OCD specialist, it's not a really disguisable disorder. Like, it's just like it walks into my office and I just see it. It's like 6 feet tall.
Okay.
When you know what to look for,
Yeah.
It is really apparent. It's not diagnostically tricky, in my opinion, as a therapist who specializes in OCD. The hard part is that most mental health professionals are not trained in diagnosing and assessing OCD. And it's not similar to anxiety. And so all those skills and tools that you learn for anxiety, you can't use those for OCD. It's a totally different skill and a different assessment. So the first thing I always tell parents is find an OCD specialist, because you can do more harm than good going to a general practitioner who says they understand OCD and actually truly believes it themselves, and is misdiagnosing and mistreating the actual problem.
So I guess I just lucked out that for some reason, I literally was driving home one day and it was like, oh my gosh, this is what it is. I figured out what it was. And then we went and sought treatment at that. But it took me a little while. But I was surprised at how quickly it can hijack your child if it's not treated properly. I felt like it was, I akin it to any other muscle. Your brain is a muscle. And if you continue, like if you're doing a bicep curl and you continue to do bicep curls, all of a sudden you got a huge bicep. That's what I felt. But I felt like it was the bicep when I was taking, well, not that I did, but when you take steroids, like all of a sudden it just got, he was reinforcing the behaviors over and over and over again. And it got bad so quickly. And the treatment is grueling. I'll ask you to determine or tell about the treatment here in just a minute, but I will tell you from a parent's perspective, well, too, it was the hardest thing that I have ever had to do, because I felt like I went against every parental instinct when I was working with him on it. So let's talk about the treatment for OCD. And quite frankly, I found that the treatment for OCD was stuff I also used for anxiety. When my daughter had anxiety or has anxiety, we use some of that too.
There's a little bit of a difference that is small but really important. And that is the reframing of cognitive distortions. And so when I'm dealing with someone who has anxiety and they're anxious, that there's a bad guy up in their room or something, we're going to reframe that thought. Does it make sense? How is your house safe? Are there locks in your house? What's your neighborhood like? We're going to be talking facts to anxiety. And that's going to be reducing it. Just like with my social anxiety, reframing my cognitive distortions of, does it really matter what they think? Can I survive this? Will I be okay even if they don't like me? Yes, I can get through that. Okay, I can accept the worst case scenario. I'm going to be okay. With OCD, the more you rationalize with OCD, the bigger it grows. And so it's really counterintuitive. If someone says, I'm really worried I'm a bad person, Mom, I think I was gossiping yesterday with my friends, and you say, well, we all gossip sometimes, and just be careful and don't do it again, but it's good that you have insight. You just actually did a compulsion with your child. You reassured them. And now OCD actually, those neural pathways that you're talking about, that muscle is physiologically those neural pathways in the brain. And the more you ride those neural highways, the bigger it grows, literally. And so we can do that by doing anxiety approaches. And therapists can do this too, by providing that reassurance. And then all of a sudden they come back stronger. But what if, Mom, but then I thought I was going to call her a bad word, and then this happened. You can't get off that hamster wheel now because you're not talking to your child, you're talking to OCD. And so that is a big difference. And it's a hard difference to decipher when you're in the weeds with that.
Well, and it's very hard from somebody who is not experiencing it or the first time experiencing it to even understand. It doesn't seem real. It's so out of the ordinary that you're, at least for me, I just stepped back. I was like, what's going on? I honestly think that in our case for my son, he was confused by what was going on too.
Yeah.
He knew that he should not be thinking that. Those weren't rational thoughts, but he continued to have them.
Yeah. And I think that's the overwhelming part of OCD. And that's part of the treatment, is letting them know that there's a name for it, that
Right.
These intrusive thoughts are common, and that it does feel foreign, because it really does feel like a foreign thought, like something's taking over your brain, because you're like, why am I having this intrusive thought to do this? Or that this is going to happen? And sometimes OCD isn't about a thought or a bad thing happening. Sometimes it's about a discomfort. Like, I just need to do it until it feels just right, over and over and over and over again. Or this feels disgusting and I have to avoid this and it's contaminated. There's lots of different themes. But just because you have it doesn't mean you understand it. And I think that's part of the distress, is people think they're losing their mind. They think that they're going crazy. They're embarrassed, depending on what their themes are. And so the first step as a therapist, even more so than anxiety, we do this with anxiety too, but even more so, is to say, this happens to lots of people. There's a name for this. These thoughts are not your own. They're OCD, but they're normal in the OCD world. These are common intrusive thoughts. To bring that validation and reduce that shame is the first step.
Yeah. Yeah. Separating it from the person.
Yes.
Yeah. We called it COD because we had to mess up all the words. So we called it COD. But yeah, it was separating it from. But the other thing is that we tried to reframe it that it can also be, when tamed, his superpower. The ability to do some of these things could be a superpower, but it just had to be tamed.
Yes. I think it is important with anxiety and OCD. Now we can lump them together, to be like the type of person, the type of brain that has anxiety or OCD is often the creative brain, is often the intelligent brain, the kind-hearted brain, the brain that notices the small details and notices things outside of the box. And I think it is important for self-esteem to highlight those superpowers. And I kind of equate it to like a diamond. You can't see it. It's a piece of coal. We have to kind of shine it off and work on it to get to the diamond. And all that mucky stuff are the compulsions and the bossy stuff that are kind of controlling your life, or the avoidance if we're talking about anxiety. And we just need you to shine. What's that song? Shine like a diamond?
Yeah, right. I'm not going to sing it, please.
I know, I was about to, and I was like, okay, let me just say
it. What age does it normally present?
I think it can show up really early. That's my bias. I feel like research is a little behind in that, because I think until kids are school aged and it starts to impact their school environment, similar to ADHD and other disorders, it doesn't get noticed. But I know in my practice, I saw a lot of toddlers. I think I just got a reputation for being the very young child OCD specialist. And so I saw toddlers and preschoolers. Normally, I think onset is 10 to 12, typically in that range, maybe a little bit older. But I feel like we can catch it much earlier. A lot of times it gets dismissed by the pediatricians, who will say, this is kind of normal, or this is just developmental, or they'll grow out of it. And so it really doesn't get on people's radar until they're older.
Right. Until it becomes disruptive to their life.
Right.
I mean, that's
Right.
really what it was. It's not, and it really doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal until it is disruptive to your life, right? Until, I mean, it's causing you distress.
A lot of times I think it's going on, it's like the iceberg. It's going on in our kids' minds. It's going on in their behavior, but they haven't impacted us yet. And so by the time it impacts us, and a lot of times they don't even tell you. I mean, I've worked with kids who will be like, I actually had this at 4 and 5, but it's not until it's disrupting the family system that we as parents notice it and say, whoa, this is out of the blue. This just popped up. But there's often unless it's pandas or pans, but there's often like a little bread trail, crumb trail, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. I eat all of that, so I don't know. I couldn't tell if you.
Pick your food.
But that's a great point. It's not really until it impacts us.
Yeah.
Ooh, now I've got a little bit of guilt sitting here, just so we know.
Well, you should. I feel like I've missed so much, and I talk to my kids, and this is what I do for a living. And I'll talk to my kids, and they'll go back to when they're younger, and they'll tell me things that I did not know. Oh, I thought that this was normal, or I thought that most people don't know how long to wipe, or things that I'm like, that's clearly OCD that you had when you were little. But how are we supposed to know everything? And that's why I tell parents, we're only one piece of the puzzle. Like, our job is to coach our kids because they have a front row seat to anxiety and OCD. We do not, and we never will.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Well, I even look at some of the things. I mean, you can only do the best that you can do, right? I look back at my daughter, and we would go to parties and such, and she would like pull herself away and go sit in a corner or go hide under a table. And now I'm like, she was trying to protect herself. She had always had anxiety. She just was trying to pull herself away. And I wasn't recognizing. I thought, oh, okay, she's overstimulated, which she probably was. But it was this protective way that they're trying to deal with whatever the situation is.
Yeah. And I think that clarity sometimes comes with more education as we see their issues. Then we look back and we're like, oh, okay, all that kind of makes sense.
So for parents out there I just mentioned guilt. Your child has an OCD diagnosis. Is it the parents' fault? Did the parents do something wrong? Is it genetic? Or what do you tell parents?
Well, I think that there's something innate about us as parents that we have to feel guilt. And I don't know why that is. I just think parenting and guilt, like, they're synonymous. And I wish that wasn't the case, because I really feel like we have a finite amount of energy, and that guilt depletes us, and it robs our energy that could go towards our kids, in that spiral of guilt. With anxiety and OCD, these are highly genetic disorders. I was an anxiety and OCD therapist before I birthed my 3 kids. I knew a lot of stuff. It runs in my family, and yet my kids still develop full-blown disorders, even though I was aware of it and trying to do the best I could, because it's highly genetic. And there are things that will happen environmentally that kind of like spring that genetic seed or sprout that genetic seed. And we can't control those either. There can be environmental factors, environmental stressors. Someone says something at school, or somebody throws up at school, and a lot of times I think sometimes parents will fixate on the thing that sprouted the seed, and they get stuck on that. Oh, if we didn't get divorced, this wouldn't have happened. Or, oh, he wasn't at school when that boy threw up, this wouldn't have happened. And really, OCD is just waiting to be sprouted. I'm using a lot of weird analogies today.
That's okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, it could be anything. Our kids are not wrapped in bubble wrap. Like, these things are going to happen just like a health issue, like a predisposition to asthma or a food allergy. These things can happen.
So it's basically just waiting there for the match to be lit. And what is that event that's going to take place that's going to light that fire? So it has to be triggered by something, or it doesn't have to be.
Yeah. And I feel like the science is not, people will debate like what causes OCD. We're still in the dark ages of what causes OCD. We know that there is a genetic component, but we know it's not all, because there's been identical twin studies, and it's not 100% that like both twins get OCD. So obviously there's an environmental component, but what that is, then we kind of debate. And is it the environment that causes the OCD, or vice versa? Is it an autoimmune issue? Is it inflammation? I mean, you can go anywhere with OCD.
Yeah, I've been down that rabbit hole, which then makes it even more difficult too, as to, okay, where does my focus need to be to help this child? Is it on the diet? Is it on the environment? Is it, is. And what I realized for myself, that the first thing I needed to focus on was treating the symptoms.
Yeah.
That was first and foremost, because if I didn't treat the symptoms, then they just got worse and worse and worse and worse.
Yeah. I think regardless of what caused the OCD, once the OCD is like Pandora's box. Like once it's out, it has to be dealt with regardless. If you're dealing with PANDAS and PANS, which is, due to strep infection or another environmental like stressor, we're talking about like mold or an infection, or, we can go down that rabbit hole. If there's a suspicion of that, and you can look at pandasnetwork.org and like learn all about that, then yes, go to a PANDAS doctor, get your medical stuff, ruled in or ruled out. Sometimes even if they do get a diagnosis of PANS, there's nothing they can do about it. I mean, with my son, he was diagnosed with PANS. My daughter has anxiety and OCD, was not diagnosed with that, but she has celiac. Autoimmune issues are rampant in my family. And I often wonder, is it that we all have anxiety and OCD and autoimmune issues, or we have autoimmune issues and so we have anxiety and OCD? Who knows? It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, yeah.
Because at the end of the day, there's nothing that he can take. There's no medicine that he can take for his PANS. There's been no identified issue that we can fix biologically with him. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes they find a smoking gun and they can treat that and that reduces symptoms. But even when the symptoms are reduced, the OCD has been let out of the box. And so you still have to do the therapies for OCD because you can't undo that. You can't bring it back in. The symptoms might get less severe for sure, but then you still have to do ERP, which is the go-to approach for OCD.
And ERP is exposure response therapy. Well,
yeah.
What's the P?
Response prevention.
Prevention. I was like, wait a second. Therapy doesn't work. Prevention. That's it. And that was the one that I was saying was awful for me, was because you had to expose your child to what they feared or what that trigger was over and over and over again so that they could retrain their brain that it wasn't a threat. Is that how you would say that?
I think research has kind of shown lately that it's more about training the brain that we can handle the discomfort. Because there are threats that we may never know. I'm afraid of dying or I'm afraid of going to hell. I may never know if that's true or not. I can't disprove it. And sometimes you can do an exposure and it will go as bad as you thought. So it's not always to prove that OCD was lying and like everything's going to be beautiful and like rainbows and butterflies are going to happen. It's more of you can do this hard thing, get your life back, get the things that you want back and sit with discomfort. And I think the important thing is it's not something we do to our kids. It's something we teach our kids to do for themselves. So I always tell parents, we're a coach. Like that's our role. And so the first step is educating them on what OCD is and then how it works in the brain in a kid-friendly way. This is kind of what I do with my resources is like talk about that highway, and how like when we ride that highway, we're feeding OCD, and then talk about how if you take a different highway, you don't go down that road. You're like, I'm taking a left instead of a right. That's what exposure is. And so learning how to sit in the discomfort, not scratch that itch, that is the compulsion, and sometimes triggered on purpose to like build those positive muscles on handling discomfort. I can say this word that triggers OCD and I'm going to sit here and I'm not going to ask you for reassurance, or I'm going to, touch that doorknob and I'm not going to wash my hands and I'm going to sit with this discomfort. And so purposely triggering OCD and then not writing down those neural pathways. And so you teach your brain to have an alternative path.
Got it. So you talked a little bit about your resources that you have for parents. Can you go over those real quickly? Because I know that so many people have benefited from what you are providing out there on a mass scale, really on a big scale.
It has gotten a little bit big, mass, global. So my free resources, I have AT Parenting Survival podcast every Tuesday, YouTube videos for kids, teens, and young adults every Thursday. And then I have an online school where there are like courses that kids and teens can take directly or parents can take directly. I have about, maybe 8 classes in there based on anxiety and OCD themes because a lot of people just have barriers to access care. I have AT Parenting Community, which is like more of an in-depth community. We do like live Zoom calls every week and we have a support group call each month for the kids and the parents. And I have a few books out there as well that you mentioned at the top of the episode.
I have to say one of the things as a parent, I went through all of our stuff 10 years ago. There wasn't much out there. And one of the things that I wanted to do now that I've gotten through the thick of things and my kids are thriving was to give hope to other parents and give them access to resources that they may not be aware of. And your resource is one of many, but like I said, your community is large, and it's such a beautiful gift that you're giving to people, that parents that are trying to struggle or trying to manage their kids and struggling to find the time and the resources to care for their kids. It's so scary as a parent to have to walk through these, this journey with your kids. So I thank you on that. I do want to talk about your book, your upcoming book, because it actually is now talking about you, and you're sharing a little bit about your experience with anxiety. And I think, as you said, because it's genetic, a lot of parents also struggle with their own anxieties when they're managing their children. So I'd like to hear a little bit your perspective as a parent, parenting kids, as a parent with anxiety, parenting kids that have anxiety.
Yeah, and I think that's a common occurrence because it is genetic. And that makes it a little bit even harder because we're triggered by our kids' issues that may be different or not. And then how do we become an anchor for our kids? I've had generalized anxiety disorder, but my front burner issue is definitely social anxiety, and raising kids with their own struggles and having their own panic and is embarrassing for my social anxiety. Worrying about my child having a panic attack in public or getting sick in public because they're so anxious they throw up, and then me feeling like, oh my gosh, that's so embarrassing. I'm not gonna be able to handle it. And so it feeds off of each other. But in my book, it really isn't about my parenting as much as it is about my own journey. And I do feel like we learn through stories. I'm a huge storyteller, and I kind of weave through my childhood and I go back and forth from childhood to my present. And I do therapy sessions with my younger versions of myself. I know. And that was actually really therapeutic writing it. It's like,
oh my goodness.
yeah, that was very therapeutic to talk. And I think we should all do this. I think it's actually like very healing. What would you say to your 7-year-old self? What would you say to your 10-year-old self? And the life lessons that you've learned and where your perspective is. And so I hope that the book is not only a memoir that's like good to read and it's engaging, but it's a roadmap of normalizing social anxiety. And even if someone doesn't have social anxiety, just to know like who hasn't felt rejection on some level and experiencing that they're not feeling like they're enough. And my hope is that it's kind of a foundation of how to feel empowered and work through that and get your power back.
Yeah. Yeah. You brought up talking to yourself and being therapeutic to your younger self. I think that's something that it's probably always been used in the clinical setting, but I think for the masses, it's just now becoming kind of out there that, you need to start looking at this stuff. The things you learned when you were a kid really do impact you, this, that, and the other. We all knew sitting back there. But I have a close girlfriend of mine who is 40 and was recently diagnosed with ADHD. This transformation of her, or the process that she's going through, has been so interesting to me. One, there's this mourning, and it's not the mourning of the sadness that she has ADHD or that she's dealing with ADHD. It's this mourning that she looks back at her childhood and sees all the things that were happening to her when she was a child and how people were reacting and how hard she was on herself.
Yeah.
And how much shame she had for that little girl. And then now there's this also, the next step has been this reckoning that's like, okay, wow, I've been diagnosed with ADHD. I can do something about this. I can now manage this and see how I can work it and move it towards working in a positive direction for me, instead of it being this ball and chain that it's been for the rest of, or for my life for so long.
Yeah. And that healing part of going back and healing the younger versions of herself,
Yeah.
because that shame and feeling like I'm not good enough or I can't do these things like everyone else, and the things that maybe she was told leave a mark. Yeah. That's interesting.
Did you know you had anxiety when you were a young child?
I didn't. And that's actually part of the book that all of my, actually to an annoying degree, I'm like arguing with each one of my younger selves because I didn't recognize social anxiety until I was in my 40s, like mid 40s.
Really?
So like
Wow.
recently, like the last decade. I always knew I had anxiety, but I didn't realize it was a disorder because my father had bipolar with psychosis and my mom had personality disorder issues and my older sister was on fire. And so I was, the middle child, don't rock the boat. So I don't think I realized how severe my own anxiety was because everyone else was chaotic.
Right. Right. And so you probably were like, I'm not like we all get, it's not as bad as that person. So it really must not be an issue.
Yeah.
Wow. How did that feel when you started to recognize that you were struggling with social anxiety?
I think it was probably kind of like your friend with the ADHD diagnosis. I think I felt sad for my younger selves, like that they weren't getting the attention and help that they needed. And what would have happened if they did get the attention and therapy that they needed, the way that I give therapy to other people. But it also was a huge relief because I think part of the story that I was telling myself that a lot of people tell themselves with social anxiety is that people just don't like them. It's really like a very fused disorder versus like OCD, where OCD, it's like, it feels really foreign, where you're like, why am I having this thought? With social anxiety, it almost feels like it's not a disorder. Like I don't want to make an excuse for myself. People just don't like me, or I'm just not good socially. And so we, often give different excuses to it. And so once I realized like, that's not the reality per se, and that there is opportunity to improve this and to work on this, and that it's not that I'm not enough. And I think that could be really healing.
I find all of this, like I said, I could spend the next 72 hours just talking about this because I just find that so interesting. Like when you think somebody doesn't like you, but yet you know that you've got friends, how does that line up in your head? You've got friends that love you. You've got a husband, you've got family. You know that people love you and like you, but at the same time, you've got a part of you that's saying they don't.
Well, and some people with social anxiety don't have friends. For myself, I really didn't have friends. And I had strained relationships with my family members because we had a bumpy childhood. And so sometimes you create situations that are coming from the social anxiety, where it's hard to connect with people. It's hard to start conversations with people. And so you do get isolated and you wind up, actually having that situation where you don't have friends, you don't have people. And so that the objective reality is that, but how you got there and why you're there, that's the different story.
Interesting. Wow. When does your book come out?
It is out.
Oh, it is?
Yes, September 19th.
Oh, yes, it is. Okay. Now I'm going to go get that because I want to read it because now I'm fascinated. So, and anybody can find it on Amazon?
Yep.
Barnes & Noble?
Anywhere. Yeah.
Oh, yay.
Books are sold. Audible, if you like audio versions. Although she does mispronounce my name, so that's really annoying.
How could you mispronounce your name?
I don't know. It was kind of a bummer. It was a voice actress.
Natasha Daniels. Do I say it right?
Natasha.
That's what she says.
Yeah, that's what she said.
Okay. I was like, that's not what I said.
That's a social anxiety exposure in and of itself. Listening to my book. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's not how you say my name, but we're going to let that go. Yeah.
So funny. With a name like Andrea Ninigian, you just let it all go. You're like, whatever, it doesn't matter. Just say whatever you want.
You get used to it. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you coming on today, and I may ask you back again because I think you have a way of talking about anxiety and OCD that, for lack of a better term, dumbs it down, makes it relatable. I don't mean to say it dumbs it down, but it does, right? It makes it, you understand it. And I think that, especially with OCD, it's such a complex disorder.
Yeah.
And can be intimidating because it's so unknown. So I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to This Way Up. I hope you're feeling a little lighter, a little brighter, and ready to take on whatever comes next. Remember, the journey of mental health is all about progress, not perfection. So keep climbing. And don't forget to celebrate the small wins. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who could use a little lift.